Hello. This video is going to just discuss generally chapters 15 through 17. Last week I touched on 14, which is actually part of this week's reading, but you can go back and look at that on the inter vivos gifts or the inter vivos transfers. So chapters 15, 16, and 17. Chapter 15, probably one of the more important chapters, at least in comparison to 14 and 16. Deals with the transfer of property. Again, it's part of this non-probate transfer process. The co-ownership material you should look at, and you should get to know the elements because you will certainly see them again. Tenancy in common, joint tenancy, tenancy by the entirety, and then community property is lumped in there, although it's a separate concept. The tenancy in common, this is going to be probably your most one of the more, or probably the most actually common type of co-ownership of property. It's two people who own it. You oftentimes see this with family members who have a more of an informal ownership, but they own equal or unequal undivided fractions of the property. And at death, each individual person's share passes either by their will or by intestate succession. Now you should ask yourself what's wrong with that, or what's potential wrong with that. And what's potentially wrong with that is, ideally you enter into these types of purchases or investments knowing the person that you're entering in with. However, if your co-owner dies, it could now go to anybody that they leave it to, or in the intestacy process, if they don't have a will, it could go to some random relative or next of kin that you're entirely unaware of. On the joint tenancy front, joint tenancy has some similarities to tenancy in common, except the people are going to own equal undivided fractional shares. And that joint tenancy is going to be presumed to have a right of survivorship. So, when one of the joint tenants dies, their share immediately distributes to the other owners. So if you have 4 people, one of them dies, then the 3 remainders become 1/3 owners in the property. As a part of that, the book talks about joint tenancy and the 4 unities, as they get referred to as time, title, interest, and possession. Look at those 4 unities and know that they must exist in order for you to have a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. It used to be that if based on those 4 unities, if one party died, then the other parties had to literally go and reinitiate a new agreement. Nowadays, that's done usually through a straw person. It gets transferred, or a straw entity, to one entity and then immediately back. That way everybody comes into their ownership at the same time and as a part of the same title. But look at those elements. The tenancy by the entirety is pretty straightforward. It's just between spouses. The book treads then into community property, and this is a little bit of an overlap between what you'll see in a family law course and this course. Community property versus equitable states. So in a community property state, the presumption is 1/2 of the other spouse's income and property is vested in the other spouse. The book lists the 9 states that are community property states. If you notice, most of them are Western states, and there's a reason for that. That's because if you imagine the settling of the country at that point, you had 2 very common themes. One is you had a lot of common law marriages, because it was difficult as the country was being settled to get back to quote-unquote civilization, to get officially married. And then as a part of community property, it was easier to assume that when 2 people were married, it was 50-50, rather than try to figure out who contributed what and at what point. Chapter 16 treads into multi-party accounts. As with the other sections, the terminology is big. But what I would probably point your attention to is it begins to move us into trust accounts. So in the trust account portion there, it talks about depositor and trust for beneficiary, or depositor or trustee for beneficiary. They're also called savings account trusts or tentative trusts. What these are bank accounts that are simply held in trust for a particular party. So these are not what we are going to move into, what are referred to as a living trust or an inter vivos trust. But consider it like the seed of what ends up being full trusts. If you've ever seen one of those timelines, those evolutionary timelines that has a human on one end and an ape on the other end, these trust accounts are the apes. They're the very basic primal version of what trusts end up being. Beyond that, just know the protections on a joint account when you're dealing with ownership rights. Joint accounts allow for the party to the other party on the account to withdraw and deposit as they see fit, and that certainly impacts what can happen after somebody passes. It's not uncommon for somebody to pass and then a joint account holder to go in and remove funds from that account because they're jointly owned. It's not 50-50. 100% is owned by both parties, and there's no way to divvy those up. So consider that when you're thinking about how an estate would be run. Is a joint account the best way? It certainly has its downside, which is control can be lost of it when that other party decides to withdraw. This chapter 17 then goes into contracts. It talks about insurance. Know the basic structure of an insurance, of an owner versus insured relationship. The premiums that are paid by the owner go to the insurer, and then the benefits go to the beneficiary. That beneficiary could be the actual owner or could be somebody else. These contracts, these insurance contracts in particular, are to a certain extent almost like a trust. When we get to trust, you're going to find out that the essence of a trust is the legal title and the equitable title or the beneficial title are split. And that's really what's happening in the insurance policy. Again, like the savings trust accounts, not exactly what we're going to go into with trust, but it's a similar type of concept. So look at those. Those people are pretty good with life insurance, understanding how it works. One part you may not be as familiar with is are the different payment methods, lump sums, installments. So take a look at those and make sure you're familiar with it. And also, although you won't be tested on the specific types of annuities, you should know generally what they are. The difference between a joint life annuity and a straight annuity and a variable annuity. Know those generally, and you should be okay. So as a part of that, the midterm is up and posted. It is due by Sunday at midnight, and as I indicated in my posting on Blackboard, if there's some sort of if there are any questions that you have any issues with, please just email me and I will get those updated. Have a good week, and I will talk with you next week. Bye-bye.